May 17, 1945. The war in Europe had been over for 9 days. Along the chalky cliffs of Dover, spring sunlight broke through the morning fog, casting long shadows across the makeshift processing centre where thousands of German prisoners waited in organised lines. The air smelled of damp wool, salt from the Channel, and something else, something unexpected, the faint sweetness of vanilla carried on the coastal wind. British soldiers moved between the rows of captured men, clipboards in hand, boots crunching on gravel. Most of the prisoners stood silent, exhausted, their Feldgrau uniforms stained and torn, their faces hollow from weeks of retreat and surrender. But scattered among these men were others, smaller figures who did not belong in any army. Boys, children wearing uniforms tailored for grown men. Sleeves rolled back to reveal thin wrists, collars loose around necks that had not yet thickened with adulthood. Some looked 15, perhaps 16. Others could not have been more than 13 or 14. Their eyes carried something different from the adult prisoners, not defeat exactly, but confusion, a kind of bewilderment at finding themselves suddenly removed from the machinery of total war and placed in a world where men offered water instead of orders, where guards spoke without shouting. Near the southern gate of the compound, a British supply lorry had arrived, carrying rations for the facility. Among the crates of tinned meat and dried biscuits sat several metal containers packed with ice and salt. Inside these containers were smaller tubs of something the British quartermaster had requisitioned from a dairy in Canterbury, ice cream, fresh churned that morning, meant originally for a nearby hospital, but rerouted when someone at command had made a spontaneous decision. The British soldiers unloading the truck paused when they saw it. One sergeant, a man named Thomas Whitmore, who had survived Dunkirk and fought through Normandy, lifted one of the containers and felt its cold weight. He looked toward the processing area where the young German prisoners stood in their sagging uniforms. He did not say anything at first. He simply carried the container toward them. The German child soldiers had been recruited in the final desperate months of the war, when the Reich's armies had burned through their reserves of able men. These boys had been pulled from Hitler youth camps, from classrooms, from farms and villages across Germany. Most had received only weeks of training before being handed rifles and sent to crumbling defensive positions along the Rhine or into the chaos of the Eastern Front. They had learned to fire weapons before they had learned to shave. They had dug trenches in frozen ground, slept in abandoned cellars, and watched their units dissolve around them as the Allied advance rolled forward. Many had been told they were defending civilization itself, that their sacrifice would preserve their homeland from destruction. Instead, they found themselves retreating through burning towns, separated from their officers, wandering westward in small groups until British or American units intercepted them. The surrender had come not as a single moment, but as a gradual realization that there was nowhere left to retreat to, no more orders to follow, no more bridges to cross. In the weeks before Germany's capitulation, the Wehrmacht and SS had increasingly relied on these adolescent conscripts to plug gaps in their collapsing defences. Records from the period show that thousands of boys born between 1928 and 1931 were pressed into military service during the final months of the war. Some divisions consisted almost entirely of such recruits, led by a handful of veteran NCOs and officers. These units suffered catastrophic casualties. Boys who had grown up in the Hitler Youth, indoctrinated with tales of martial glory and racial destiny, found themselves in situations no amount of propaganda could prepare them for. They experienced the reality of modern warfare, the random brutality of artillery, the helplessness of being outgunned and outmaneuvered, the sudden deaths of friends, the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion that reduced ideals to irrelevance. When these young prisoners arrived in British custody, they presented their captors with an uncomfortable problem. They were technically combatants, enemy soldiers who had fought against Allied forces, but they were also children, some barely into puberty. British soldiers who had spent years fighting hardened Wehrmacht troops now found themselves guarding teenagers who looked more frightened than dangerous. The initial processing involved medical examinations that revealed the extent of malnutrition and neglect. Many of the boys weighed significantly less than they should have for their age. Their teeth showed signs of decay. Their feet bore blisters and infections from marching in boots that did not fit. Medics documented cases of frostbite, parasitic infections, and psychological trauma. The boys did not speak much during these examinations. They answered questions with mechanical precision, giving their names, their birth dates, their units. They had been trained to provide only basic information upon capture. But their eyes betrayed their youth. Darting, uncertain, unable to maintain the stoic expression of defeated soldiers. The ice cream arrived without ceremony. Sergeant Whitmore and several other soldiers approached one of the groups of young prisoners, carrying the containers and a stack of small paper cups that had been found in the supply lorry. The boys watched with suspicion at first, unsure what this meant. They had grown accustomed to expecting the worst. In their experience, nothing came without a cost. One of the soldiers began scooping the ice cream into cups, the metal spoon scraping against the frozen dessert with a sound that seemed absurdly domestic in this setting. The first boy to receive a cup took it with both hands, staring down at the pale substance as if it might be a trick. He had probably not seen ice cream in years. Dairy products had become scarce in Germany as the war dragged on, rationed, and then eliminated from civilian diets. For these boys from working class or rural backgrounds, ice cream might have been a rare treat even before the war, something enjoyed on special occasions, if at all. The boy lifted the cup to his mouth and tasted it. His expression changed instantly. His eyes widened, and for a moment, the mask of military discipline cracked. He took another small bite, then another, his hands trembling slightly. Other boys received their portions and began eating with the same stunned hesitation. Some ate slowly, making each spoonful last. Others devoured it quickly, as if afraid it might disappear. One young prisoner, no more than 14, sat down on the ground after finishing his portion and began to cry. Not loud, dramatic sobbing, but quiet tears that ran down his dirt-stained cheeks while he stared at the empty cup in his hands. A British corporal, who had been watching from several meters away, turned aside, removing his cap to wipe at his own eyes. He had fought his way across France and into Germany. He had seen devastation and death, had become hardened to suffering. But the sight of a child weeping over ice cream struck something deeper than combat ever had. The moment spread through the compound as more containers were opened and distributed. British soldiers who had not planned to participate found themselves helping, scooping ice cream, passing out cups, watching as dozens of young German faces transformed from blank exhaustion to something approaching wonder. The boys began to talk among themselves, quietly at first, then with increasing animation. Some smiled, a few even laughed. The ice cream had done what months of propaganda could not undo. It had reminded them that they were children. For years they had been told they were soldiers, warriors, defenders of the Reich. They had been given uniforms and weapons and orders. They had been taught to suppress fear and sentiment, to value strength and obedience above all else. But ice cream was not a tool of war. It was not scarce because of strategic necessity. It was simply sweet and cold and good, a small pleasure that existed outside the logic of conflict. British officers observing the scene filed reports that noted the unexpected emotional response from both prisoners and guards. One lieutenant wrote in his diary that evening about watching a 16-year-old German boy finish his ice cream and then ask, in broken English, if there was more. When told there might be more tomorrow, the boy smiled, and the lieutenant realized he had not seen anyone smile in weeks. The war had taught all of them to expect only grimness, to treat every interaction as transactional or adversarial. This moment of shared sweetness felt like a violation of the rules both sides had been following, a sudden intrusion of normal human experience into a world that had forgotten what normal meant. The historical significance of such moments has often been overlooked in favor of more dramatic narratives about liberation and victory. But the processing centres and POW camps where German soldiers, including these child conscripts, encountered Allied custody represented a crucial junction point in the war's aftermath. For many Germans, especially the young, this was their first extended contact with the enemies they had been taught to fear and hate. Nazi propaganda had painted the British as cruel imperialists, the Americans as degenerate capitalists, all of them intent on destroying German culture and enslaving the German people. The boys arriving in these camps expected, at minimum, harsh treatment. Some expected worse. Instead, they found medical care, adequate food, and guards who treated them with something approaching decency. The ice cream was not an official policy or a calculated act of psychological warfare. It was simply a gesture, small and impulsive, born from the recognition that these were children who had been robbed of their childhood. The transformation this recognition sparked did not happen all at once. Many of the young prisoners remained suspicious for days or weeks, unable to fully accept that they were no longer in danger. Years of indoctrination and the traumatic experiences of combat had left deep marks. But gradually, as they settled into the routine of captivity, patterns emerged. The boys began to ask questions about the world outside, about what would happen to Germany, about whether they would be allowed to go home. British personnel assigned to the camps noticed that the younger prisoners responded differently than the adults. The adult Wehrmacht soldiers often maintained a sullen silence, clinging to military discipline as a way to preserve their dignity in defeat. The boys, however, showed more flexibility. They were curious, eager for information, quicker to abandon the rigid postures they had been trained to maintain. They had less invested in the ideology that had driven the war. For them, National Socialism had been the only political reality they had ever known, but it had not yet fully calcified into their identities. They could still imagine other possibilities. Records from the British War Office show that by late May 1945, over 15,000 German prisoners under the age of 18 were being held in facilities across Britain and occupied Germany. The question of how to handle these young captives generated significant debate among Allied commanders. Some argued they should be treated as prisoners of war, like any other captured enemy soldiers. Others insisted they were victims, children who had been exploited by a criminal regime. The solution adopted fell somewhere between these positions. The boys would remain in custody, but would receive educational programs designed to re-educate them about democracy and to repair some of the damage caused by years of Nazi schooling. These programs included basic literacy and mathematics for those whose education had been interrupted, as well as carefully designed lessons about history and government that challenged the narratives they had been taught. The ice cream moment, and others like it, played a subtle but important role in making this re-education possible. Before any classroom instruction could begin, the boys needed to unlearn the expectation of cruelty. They needed to see that their captors were not monsters, that the world outside Nazi Germany was not the nightmarish wasteland they had been promised. Small acts of kindness, a cup of ice cream, a British soldier sharing cigarettes, a medic taking extra time to treat a wound gently, accumulated into a broader realization. These boys began to understand that they had been lied to, not just about military strategy or the progress of the war, but about fundamental aspects of reality. The enemy was not subhuman. The outside world was not bent on their destruction. They had been used and discarded by leaders who valued them only as expendable resources. This awakening was neither universal nor complete. Some of the young prisoners clung to their beliefs, unable or unwilling to accept that everything they had been taught was false. The psychological investment required to fight and suffer in a cause does not dissolve easily, even in the face of contradictory evidence. But many others, perhaps most, showed signs of reconsidering their understanding of the world. They began to speak more openly about their experiences, to express doubts about the ideology they had been fed. In group discussions organised by British officers, some boys admitted they had joined the Hitler Youth because everyone else did, because it seemed exciting, because their teachers and parents encouraged it, they had not thought carefully about what it meant. They had been children playing at war until the war became real and terrible. The tears that British soldiers witnessed in that Dover compound and in similar facilities across Europe were not tears of joy exactly, though relief played a part. They were tears of grief, of recognition, of childhood suddenly reasserting itself after years of forced suppression. The boys cried because they were safe enough to cry, because the ice cream reminded them that pleasure and sweetness still existed, because they were beginning to process the enormity of what they had lost. Their adolescence had been stolen, their innocence weaponized. They had seen friends die, had fired weapons at strangers, had lived in constant fear and hunger. And for what? Germany lay in ruins. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had collapsed in 12. The cause they had been told was sacred and inevitable had been revealed as a grotesque lie. The ice cream, simple and cold and sweet, represented everything that lie had denied them: abundance, peace, the possibility of simple happiness. Sergeant Whitmore, who had carried that first container of ice cream to the prisoners, wrote a letter to his wife 3 days later. In it, he described the scene, struggling to articulate why it had affected him so deeply. He wrote that he had seen terrible things during the war, had become numb to much of it out of necessity. But watching those German boys cry over ice cream had broken through that numbness. It reminded him that the war had damaged everyone it touched, victors and vanquished alike. He wrote that he hoped his own son, safe in England, would never know what it meant to be so starved of simple goodness that a cup of ice cream could reduce him to tears. He hoped the world being built from the ashes of this catastrophe would be one where children could remain children, where ice cream was commonplace and unremarkable, where no one had to fight before they were old enough to understand what they were fighting for. The British government eventually repatriated most of the young German prisoners by late 1946 and early 1947. They returned to a country that bore little resemblance to the one they had left. Cities lay in rubble. Millions were dead or displaced. The political structures that had defined their youth had been dismantled. Many of these boys, now young men, found their families scattered or gone. They faced the task of rebuilding not just their country, but their own identities. They had to decide who they would become in a world where the certainties of their childhood had been exposed as poisonous fantasies. Some succeeded in this reconstruction, becoming part of the generation that would rebuild West Germany into a democratic state. Others carried the trauma of their experiences for the rest of their lives, unable to fully escape the shadows of what they had seen and done. The ice cream itself was forgotten by most. It did not appear in official histories or memorials. It was not the kind of thing that seemed significant enough to record in detail. But for the individuals who were there, both the boys who received it and the soldiers who gave it, the memory persisted. In interviews conducted decades later with German men who had been child soldiers, several recalled moments of unexpected kindness from their captors. A chocolate bar, a kind word, a small gesture that pierced through the fog of trauma and propaganda. One man, interviewed in the 1980s about his experiences as a 15-year-old soldier, mentioned being given ice cream by British troops shortly after his capture. He said it was the first time he had felt like a human being in months, the first time someone had treated him as something other than a weapon or a problem to be managed. He said he had never forgotten it, that it had changed something fundamental in how he understood the war and his place in it. The power of abundance, of simple material comfort, to reshape ideology should not be underestimated. Throughout the Cold War, this dynamic would play out on a larger scale as the prosperous West sought to demonstrate the superiority of democratic capitalism over communist authoritarianism. But in that spring of 1945, the ideological competition was between Nazi totalitarianism and Allied democracy, and the contrast could not have been starker. Germany had mobilized its children for total war, stripping them of education, stability, and safety. Britain, despite being bombed and besieged for years, despite rationing and hardship, still had ice cream to spare for captured enemy boys. That difference communicated more effectively than any speech or pamphlet could have. It said that systems which valued human dignity produced different results than systems built on domination and racial hatred. It said that peace created possibilities that war consumed. The soldiers who cried while watching those German boys eat ice cream were not weeping out of sentimentality or weakness. They were confronting the profound waste of it all. These children, who should have been in school or playing football or learning trades, had instead been marched into a catastrophe not of their making. They had been betrayed by every adult authority in their lives, their teachers who taught them lies, their leaders who used them as cannon fodder, their parents who had either supported the regime or been too intimidated to resist it. And now, in defeat, they were discovering that the world was not what they had been told. That discovery was painful and necessary. The tears were part of the process of shedding one reality and accepting another. In the decades that followed, as Europe rebuilt and the generation that fought World War II aged into history, certain questions remained persistently difficult to answer. How had ordinary people, especially ordinary Germans, participated in or tolerated such enormous evil? How had propaganda convinced millions to support a regime that brought only destruction? The answers were complex, involving ideology, fear, nationalism, economic desperation, and the incremental nature of moral compromise. But the example of the child soldiers offered one piece of the puzzle. When an entire society commits to a totalizing ideology, when every institution from schools to youth organizations to churches either supports or fails to challenge that ideology, individuals, especially young individuals, have limited resources for resistance. The boys eating ice cream in British custody had not chosen their beliefs in any meaningful sense. They had absorbed them from an environment designed to produce exactly such absorption. Breaking free required not just military defeat, but the patient work of demonstrating that alternatives existed, that the propaganda had been lies, that a different kind of life was possible. The ice cream was part of that demonstration. It was a symbol of a world these boys had been taught to despise, but which turned out to be more humane than the one they had served. It represented surplus, leisure, pleasure for its own sake, all things incompatible with total war. The Nazi regime had demanded sacrifice, discipline, denial. Every resource had to be funneled toward the war effort. Every individual had to subordinate their desires to the collective struggle. The result was catastrophe. By contrast, the Allied nations, even in wartime, maintained enough social and economic flexibility to produce ice cream, to distribute it generously, to treat it as unremarkable. That contrast illustrated something fundamental about different visions of human organization. One vision crushed the individual in service of the state. The other, for all its flaws, preserved space for individual happiness and dignity. As the sun set over Dover that evening in May 1945, the compound grew quiet. The young German prisoners settled into their barracks, lying on cots that were more comfortable than anything they had slept on in months. Some talked quietly among themselves, others lay silent, processing the day's events. The guards patrolled the perimeter, their rifles slung over their shoulders, smoking cigarettes and speaking in low voices. The war in Europe was over. The war in the Pacific continued, but it felt distant from this place. Here, on the English coast, in a temporary camp filled with captured children, something small but significant had occurred. A moment of grace had interrupted the machinery of violence and retribution. It would not undo the years of suffering or bring back the dead. It would not erase the crimes of the regime these boys had served, but it planted a seed, a tiny possibility that even those who had been shaped by evil might be reshaped by good, that the cycle of hatred and violence might be broken, that children who had been turned into soldiers might someday become simply men, living ordinary lives in a world that had finally learned its lesson. The lesson, of course, would prove harder to learn and easier to forget than anyone hoped. But in that moment, as British soldiers scraped the last of the ice cream from metal containers and watched German boys lick their fingers clean, hope seemed justified. The war was ending. The children who had fought it were beginning to heal. And somewhere in the simple act of sharing something sweet with someone who had been an enemy, humanity reasserted itself against the forces that had tried so hard to extinguish it. The tears that flowed that day, from boys who tasted peace for the first time in years, from soldiers who saw in those boys the cost of what they had been fighting, were not a sign of weakness, but of awakening. The painful, necessary recognition that we are all diminished by war, all capable of being either victim or perpetrator, and all in the end dependent on small acts of mercy to remind us what we might yet become.